King Charles is not well, and the people closest to the throne know something the public is only beginning to process, that the question of succession has shifted from theory to something far more immediate. What most coverage gets wrong is the framing. This isn't a story about who comes next. It's a story about why, now, what Charles knows, what files have quietly surfaced around the transition, and what forces were already moving before anyone made it official. The stakes here are bigger than a title. They always were. William has been named royal successor, but here is what they are not telling you up front. That naming happened on September 8, 2022, the exact moment Queen Elizabeth died and Charles became king. William became heir apparent automatically, legally, without ceremony or announcement. That part is not the story. The story is what comes next, because sources close to the palace suggest the real question was never whether William would eventually become king. It was always when, and right now that question carries a weight it never has before. Charles ascended at 73, the oldest person ever to take the British throne, after spending more decades waiting than any heir in recorded history. He understood, better than anyone alive, what it means to watch power pass slowly. Then, in February 2024, came the cancer diagnosis, discovered almost by accident during treatment for a separate condition entirely. The palace confirmed it, engagements paused, the world recalibrated. Now there is a man on the throne who is genuinely unwell, who has already watched one era end, and who is quietly making decisions that look less like a king settling in and more like a king preparing something. The succession was never secret, but the files surrounding what Charles has been doing since that diagnosis, that is a different matter entirely. And what those files suggest about the pressure building around William is where this story actually begins. Now, here is what people keep missing when they focus entirely on William. The real pressure in this story is not coming from the heir. It is coming from the man wearing the crown. Charles was coronated in May 2023, a ceremony watched by hundreds of millions that looked, on the surface, like the beginning of a long and stable reign. Less than 12 months later, in February 2024, the palace announced a cancer diagnosis, discovered almost incidentally during treatment for a separate benign prostate condition, not sought, found. And that is only half the story. Charles did not retreat. He did not hand anything over. Sources suggest that within weeks of the diagnosis going public, he was already pushing back against the reduced schedule his medical team had reportedly outlined, not dramatically, quietly, but the pattern is verifiable in the public record. Engagements resuming faster than most observers expected. Appearances continuing at a pace that genuinely surprised royal correspondents who had been told to expect a significantly lighter calendar. Then came Andrew. In 2025, Charles removed his brother's remaining titles, styles, and honors, a decision that had been discussed internally for years. But the timing matters. A king managing serious illness, simultaneously making the most publicly decisive housekeeping move of his reign. So why now? Why remove Andrew while pushing through health complications? The answer is that Charles is not managing decline. He is managing legacy. There is a difference, and the decisions he has been making since that February diagnosis look less like a man slowing down and more like a man who has calculated exactly how much time he has to set things in order, which raises a question nobody has answered cleanly. When a king makes these moves, what legal framework is he actually operating within? And how much of what Charles is doing is already written into law versus how much is genuinely his to decide? Now, before anyone inside the palace makes a move, there is a legal architecture that governs all of it, and most people have never actually looked at it. Here is what the framework says. Succession to the British throne is not decided by royal decree, personal preference, or secret documentation. It is regulated by parliamentary statute, specifically the Succession to the Crown Act 2013, which updated centuries of prior legislation and codified exactly who stands in line and under what conditions. Sources familiar with constitutional law describe it as deliberately mechanical. The moment Charles became king in September 2022, William became heir apparent, automatically, irrevocably, no announcement required. So the question people keep asking, whether Charles has formally named William his successor, is, constitutionally speaking, the wrong question. That naming already happened, by law. But succession and power transfer are two completely different things, and this is where it gets genuinely interesting. The mechanism that actually shifts operational authority is the Councillors of State system. Under this arrangement, designated senior royals can legally act on the monarch's behalf, signing documents, attending Privy Council meetings, performing specific functions of the crown. It is not ceremonial, it is constitutionally functional, and sources suggest that what Charles has been quietly doing throughout his treatment period is not symbolic reassurance, it is active deployment of exactly these instruments, precisely calibrated, precisely deniable, which brings up something nobody has satisfactorily explained. If the legal framework handles succession automatically, and the counselors of state mechanism covers operational gaps, why does Charles's public-facing schedule still list him as primary host on major state engagements he may genuinely be unable to attend? That contradiction is not administrative oversight. It is the story. Charles's official court circular, the palace's own formal record of royal engagements, continued listing him as primary host on major state occasions deep into his treatment period. Sources suggest that, internally, aides were managing a genuine scheduling tension that the public record simply did not reflect. And that tension has a very specific shape. Physician guidance around the type of systemic treatment Charles was reportedly receiving typically involves careful management of fatigue, immune vulnerability, and unpredictable capacity windows. Sources close to the palace suggest that on certain confirmed engagement dates, Charles's medical team had flagged real uncertainty about his ability to attend. Yet the public schedule remained unchanged. Why does that matter? Because the court circular is not a draft document. It is a formal constitutional record. When an engagement is listed and then quietly adjusted, or when a counselor of state steps in without public acknowledgement, the gap between what was announced and what actually happened becomes a question that nobody officially answers. That is deliberate. The palace has been operating a dual-track system, the formal schedule projecting stability, and a parallel operational reality absorbing whatever Charles genuinely cannot carry. Nothing individually constitutes a crisis, but collectively, it describes a king whose public-facing capacity and actual medical capacity are being managed as two separate things. The real question is not whether Charles can continue. He clearly is continuing. The question is, who is actually absorbing the weight when the schedule says Charles, but the room says otherwise? And that answer leads directly to the mechanism the palace quietly upgraded in 2022. An amendment so carefully worded that most people completely missed what it actually authorized. Now here is where the 2022 amendment becomes genuinely important, because what Parliament quietly passed that December was not symbolic. The Regency Act, 1937, had always included a Councillors of State mechanism, a short list of senior royals authorized to perform certain constitutional functions if the monarch became temporarily incapacitated or was abroad. For decades, that list included individuals who had either stepped back from royal duties or were no longer practically available. By 2022, sources suggest that structural gap had become impossible to ignore. So Parliament passed the Councillors of State Act 2022, and what it did precisely was add Prince William and Princess Anne to the active Councillors of State list, expanding it from 4 names to 6. That is only half the story, because what the amendment authorizes is genuinely significant, and what it does not authorize is equally revealing. Councillors of State can attend Privy Council meetings, sign routine documents, and receive ambassadors on the monarch's behalf. They cannot dissolve Parliament. They cannot create peers. They cannot pardon. The core constitutional levers remain exclusively with the monarch. Sources familiar with the structure describe it as a pressure valve designed to absorb operational load without transferring actual sovereignty. But here is what that framing quietly admits. In order to need the pressure valve upgraded, the palace had to first acknowledge the pressure was building. The amendment was introduced in November 2022, passed in December 2022, and received royal assent within weeks. The speed was deliberate. This was not a routine tidy-up. This was contingency architecture being quietly installed while the public conversation remained fixed on the coronation preparations. And the choice to include Anne alongside William was not accidental. William carries the succession weight. Anne carries the operational credibility. Decades of institutional knowledge that William still cannot fully replicate. So the palace now has 2 councillors capable of absorbing genuine constitutional pressure. That is not crisis management, but it is unmistakably preparation. The question that nobody inside the institution will answer on the record is, what specifically triggered the urgency of December 2022? And that question leads directly to what has since been described as the secret files, and whether anything those files allegedly contain actually exists at all. Everything built so far, all of it has been traceable, verifiable, grounded in actual parliamentary statute and documented palace decisions. The secret files claim is different, and sources suggest the difference matters enormously. So let's audit it honestly, because that is the only way this story actually means anything. What exists in the secret file is a pattern familiar to anyone who has watched royal coverage for long enough. Tabloid scaffolding built around genuine structural changes, then labeled as something more dramatic than the evidence supports. accounts. And here is what actually happened. The genuine story is, on its own, genuinely significant. But significance, apparently, wasn't considered enough. So the real constitutional preparation gets reframed as secret files, deliberately, because secret files feel more like power and less like bureaucratic prudence. But here is the thing. Bureaucratic prudence at this level, inside this institution, quietly reshaping who holds constitutional authority during a monarch's medical vulnerability, that is not ordinary. That is the palace telling you something in the only language it actually speaks, structural change rather than press releases. The secret files claim is tabloid scaffolding. I will not pretend otherwise. What is underneath that scaffolding, though, is real. A king managing a cancer diagnosis while continuing public duties, a constitutional mechanism already expanded to absorb potential incapacity, an heir with a growing independent operation that the palace is not meaningfully denying, nothing individually explosive, everything collectively pointing in the same direction, and what that direction looks like in practice. The actual footprint William has been quietly building, the income streams, the household, the independent foreign trips, is the part the secret files narrative was always trying to describe but couldn't quite reach. So, here is what the secret files narrative was always gesturing at, but never quite able to name cleanly: the actual footprint. Because, while tabloids were constructing paper trails that do not exist, William was quietly building something that does, and sources suggest the scale of it, assembled piece by piece over the last 2 years, is more significant than any single dramatic announcement could convey. Start with the money. The Duchy of Cornwall, the estate that funds the heir apparent's operation, generated over £23 million in net surplus in the most recent reported year. That is William's operational budget, not a ceremonial allowance, a functioning financial engine that supports his household, his staff, his independent program. Charles ran the same duchy for decades before accession. William is running it now with the same institutional seriousness, and the household has grown to match. Sources suggest William's independent staff structure has expanded meaningfully since 2022. Private secretaries, communications directors, policy advisors, the architecture of a parallel operation rather than a subsidiary one. Then there are the foreign trips. William has led independent diplomatic visits without Charles, carrying full ceremonial weight and conducting bilateral meetings. That is not a prince on a goodwill tour. That is a future king in rehearsal, and everyone in those receiving governments knows it. Now, none of this is secret. None of it required files. The palace publishes the duchy accounts. The trips are photographed. The staff appointments are announced. But collectively, what it describes is a power migration that is already in motion, quiet, deliberate, and entirely deniable as anything more than normal institutional preparation. The question that nobody has answered cleanly yet is, who, inside the palace walls, is managing the pace of that migration, and whether everyone closest to Charles is actually comfortable with the answer. Now, all of that shifting weight doesn't exist in a vacuum. It lands inside a palace that has been quietly, genuinely restructured since Camilla became queen consort in May 2023. And that restructuring is where credible royal correspondents have started asking harder questions. Sources suggest the changes to Camilla's office since the coronation have been more substantial than public communications imply. Her household absorbed additional staff, took on a dedicated communications function, and secured operational independence from the joint Buckingham Palace press office. On paper, that looks like a queen consort settling into her constitutional role. But sources close to palace operations describe something more contested, a parallel infrastructure quietly asserting influence over engagements, scheduling, and public narrative. The friction isn't tabloid invention. Royal correspondents at the BBC and The Times have separately noted genuine tension over advisory access to Charles. Specifically, who gets proximity when decisions are being made behind closed doors? That's not a personal squabble. That is an institutional question about whose counsel shapes the king. Here's what makes it structurally significant. Camilla's office controls her own diary independently. William's household does the same. Charles, meanwhile, is managing a cancer diagnosis that has already compressed his available working hours. When 3 power centers each operate autonomously inside one institution and the person at the center is physically constrained, coordination becomes impossible to avoid. The choice Camilla's office appears to have made, based on publicly observable scheduling patterns, is consolidation rather than deference. More joint appearances with Charles, more visible positioning at state moments, less visible coordination with Kensington Palace, which raises the question that feeds directly into everything Charles has done next. If he has genuinely reasserted control, and there is evidence that he has, what exactly was he reasserting it against? So what does it actually mean when we say Charles has taken control? That question is not as simple as it sounds. The public record shows a king who has continued signing off on consequential decisions throughout his cancer treatment. Andrew's title's gone in early 2025. The counselors of state expansion quietly locked in. William's independent operational capacity deliberately expanded. None of those moves happened accidentally. Each required Charles to initiate it. That matters because there is a version of this story where a king managing a serious diagnosis simply lets institutional momentum carry things forward. That is not what the evidence shows. What sources suggest, based on the observable pattern, is a man methodically consolidating the terms of his own succession before it becomes someone else's choice to manage. But here is the complication. Reasserting control and managing decline are not mutually exclusive. A king can do both simultaneously, and from the outside, the two look almost identical. The question is, which impulse is driving the sequence? What we do know is this. Every structural decision Charles has visibly made since his diagnosis has pointed in one consistent direction. William's position strengthens, Camilla's proximity to operational power remains visible, but carefully bounded, and Charles himself stays the author of the arrangement. He is not abdicating the story. He is writing it. So when does writing the story become refusing to let it end? And that is the question that actually matters. Not whether William is ready, he is. Not whether the legal framework exists to transfer authority, it does. The real cliffhanger buried inside everything we have examined is far more human than any secret file could capture. Charles spent 70 years waiting. Longer than any heir in British history. He watched his mother reign into her 90s, adapting, enduring, refusing to yield the pen. Sources suggest that experience did not simply make him patient, it made him precise about what holding power actually costs a person when they finally have it. Now he has it, and his diagnosis has quietly introduced a clock that did not exist before. The constitutional mechanisms are ready. The counselors of state amendment is already in place. William's operational footprint has expanded. Every structural piece has been positioned. What no document can mandate is the moment a king decides the institution's continuity genuinely outweighs his own authorship of it. The question is whether Charles, having waited longer than anyone, will recognize that moment earlier than his mother did, or whether the same quality that made him methodical, that made him deliberate, that made him write this story on his own terms, will also make him hold the pen slightly too long. No file answers that. That decision belongs entirely to Charles, and he has not made it yet.